Hey everybody, this is Marsha Pierce. I am the Director of Solutions Architecture at Pure Storage, and I'm excited to be talking to you today at the DBS Summit about migrating your database like a rock star. So to tell you a little bit about myself, prior to doing what I do now, I was a real life DBA every day, working for lots of companies, migrating databases all the time. So let's talk a little bit about like what that was. How do you like this new thing you can do on Zoom? You can see me while I got my slides in the background. So all the scripts that I'm using today will be shared in a folder and you'll have access to them. And so you should be able to see everything. So I ran a lot of migration, I call them factories as a data architect, not my favorite part of my job. But it seemed to be something that a lot of people had problems with. And so I kind of fell into my lap doing over and over again at several different companies. So we did lots of consolidations, lots of migrations and stuff like that. We found a lot of issues when we tried to migrate individual databases, and we did have to do that from time to time. But that usually led us to relying on other people. So what we're going to talk about today is migrating one entire instance from one server to another. We're not going to talk as much about flipping compatibility mode because I think most people know about flipping compatibility mode and all the checks that you have to do. That's pretty well documented, but there's lots of other things that get you when you have to migrate between different servers, right? That we don't normally think about as DBAs that causes issues. So, at the peak of what I call my migration run, we were doing sometimes 3 different instances a week. And these were really large instances, 2,500 terabyte instances that we were moving, and they had hundreds of databases on them, right? And they had been around for a long time. So there was lots of technical debt on there. A lot of the stuff that had been deployed, we weren't originally there for. So, turnover from the DBAs, we had to have these really short rollout times. Most of the time we could get it done in 15, 20 minutes, but we had a 4-hour window. Sometimes though, we only had a 2-minute window. And the technique I'm going to show you, we were actually able to do once we had done this a couple times, we were able to actually do in a 2-minute time frame. So we could migrate really, really large instances very, very quickly. And I think the only thing that we accounted for, we did these, it was a thing that was kind of a process improvement that we did all the time. Every time we found a bug, something that didn't work, we would add it to our scripts. And after we had been doing this for a while, it got really kind of tried and true where we really didn't have any issues. The only thing we couldn't account for was an IP address change. And so this does not account for an IP address change. It does count for server names change. It doesn't matter if you're going from physical to virtual. It even accounts for the fact that you have transactional replication going on. It's going to be pretty large and you don't want to have to reseed it. So we've done that. And we kind of breaking this down into several stages. So it takes a lot of prep. I'm going to go for the first part of this and kind of talk to you about the documentation part. And then I'm going to stop sharing this. And I'm actually going to go over to what our documentation looked like that we kind of evolved into using. So you have to have everything really well documented, right? So that you know what's going on. So the documentation of the current environment, right? We listed the servers that were being migrated, their current database version, their current encryption levels, right? We had to know what they were encrypted before we even touched anything. Were they full? Were they simple in the bulk? And all this is going to be important later when you start doing this because we're going to automate some of this with scripts. We're using GTMs, basically C names, and alias pointing to your database. We would track those down and log those so we could get those pointed over to the new server. All those aliases, server principal names, those are something you have to think about. Application host, right? Sometimes it's easy to move the database, but getting the applications to reconnect is a problem. That's why we went with the whole instance moves. Counting for service accounts, ETL jobs. You can do this first in your QA and dev environment if you have those. Or maybe it's a good time to sometimes, if you don't, to get them set up and test this out, doing this kind of move for those QA and dev jobs. Making sure that the current DB settings get over to the new server, that you have those security certificates, that link servers are applied, file shares are working, making sure all the Windows options are set, and the power plans and block size. This is just the first part of what we're going to do. And so we're kind of documenting all that in this kind of spreadsheet right here. And then we have scripts to populate this. And then I couldn't kind of fold it all in. I probably could have if I'd taken more time into the spreadsheet. So then on top of that, once I kind of like talk about how we're going to populate the spreadsheet with some scripts, then we have some folders with a whole bunch of other scripts that we're going to run that we're going to populate into the spreadsheet. So let's get back to sharing the screen, and I'm going to share my other desktop real quick. And we're going to take a look at what that spreadsheet looks like. So when we look over here at my spreadsheet, let's get back all the way to the beginning. So the first thing I do, and this template spreadsheet is going to be uploaded as well. So what we have is this server info tab. And on here, we put our instance name. If it's a clustered instance server, right, and we're sitting across more than one server, we're going to actually put the physical server's names, any aliases that we know of that kind of reference that are on the SQL server itself. We're going to put the IP address of the server and the port number, right? Because people don't always use the same port number, and that will sometimes get you during a move. And then the service account. It's good to try to keep the same service account if you can, but if not, we'll talk about what you need to do. And so we kind of manually populate that information. Then we want to kind of document all of our DBs. And I have a whole lot of information on here. I've got the date that I pulled the information. This is actually kind of an old like spreadsheet I had that I kind of cleaned up. It's got the physical server name on there, and then it has all the different databases names, right? How big are those databases? Are they empty or they're full? I have seen instances where we had like 10 terabyte databases with like 1 meg in them, right? So those are the things you want to know. Is the database almost full, or is it a big database sitting out there empty? What is their current compatibility level that they're set to? And what is their state description? Sometimes they're all online. Sometimes you have read-only ones that you wouldn't pop in there, that you wouldn't expect. Then what is their current recovery model? Because we're going to log ship these databases. We're going to have to set them all to full. So we need to know what the recovery model is so that at some point in the future, we can get back to maybe the same recovery model that we had. Maybe we don't want to, but if we need to in the future, we have this documented. And then we need to know, hey, is this database a publisher or is it a subscriber? And then I have this thing called activity log. In my script, it's really kind of only looking at the current activity to see if it's looking at a couple different things. Is there any index usage in there or user connections going in there? I also got a portion of the script where you can see we actually had a database where we logged that information from SPID stats log. We called the SPID stats log, where we just ran an SP-who and logged all that information in there. And then we actually logged our index usage stats every day. And this was really kind of important because we could get a good detailed usage information when we did this. Hey, has anybody used this database for like 6 months or so? And we kind of did this at first on a lark, but amazing things, as you'll see, kind of happen. And I've got some examples of the data. And then if we have some cleanup to do, I actually had, here it's assigned to me, because we noticed on this one, and I'll show you the query in this, it shows in here some more detailed information that this one may be some ones that I may not need anymore. And why is that? And then from those queries that we have individually, we did, are they master key encrypted? Are they TDE encrypted? And then there's some notes that we can kind of take over this while we're looking. The next thing we document, and we'll get more to this in a minute, are all the GTMs. So we used a lot of GTMs for the individual databases themselves. And so here's, the kind of the IP address where they're pointing and all that stuff. And so in this case, we did a lot of moving between different enclaves. So we weren't maintaining the same IP addresses. So all of these aliases had to be repointed to the new IP address. So we made sure we documented all of those. Then this is kind of like my, one of my favorite ones too. The other thing that we did was we would run the SP configure with the show advanced options of 1. And we would pop that in here, right? So if you look, this is my source server, the server that I'm going to migrate. And I've set up a brand new server, right? And I installed SQL Server and I ran that. And then I kind of evened out. If they had some different versions in here, I would kind of move one down, right? the mail store procedures, right? Those XPs went away, and that kind of got renamed in later versions. So I would put some spaces, and then we had this comparison check already here that would show, you know, do these data values match up? Are they good? I don't have my values in here now, but when you paste them in here from your target server, you want all of this to be true. And if it's a false, because these will change color, then you can go through and update that information. Let's see, it's been a while since I've done this. I forgot to look at this before I popped it in here, but let's kind of show you what that looks like. So when we put this in here, you can see that value changes to true. So that's a really good gut check to make sure that people actually did what they said, because as you know, people say they do things a lot of times, but when you go to do the migration, somebody's like, well, I thought I did that and I forgot. So having the spreadsheet that you can look at and somebody else can review, and then somebody else can kind of run the same steps and make sure that you had the same value, having people double checking is a really good thing. Then that came all from this SP, the SP configure. And then I have the original values of server B. So I can take these in here. I had server A, right? And then I had server B. I can take these values in here and pop them in there. Now the connections, this is coming from my connections query. And this is, and I blanked that out. I actually have that, and I'll pop this in the spreadsheet. I have that in my scripts, and here's a connection query filtered. So what this does is it goes through and it looks at all the connections that are connected to the database, and it doesn't matter what they are. And I threw some ones in here. I'm like, hey, I've got, you know, I work with Melody Zacharias, and I think I had Argenis in here at one time, and myself. Yeah, here we all are. Right? We're DBAs. I don't really care about the connections. The reason why I'm logging these connections is I want to know who is connecting to the server, right? Because sometimes applications connecting to the servers can be problems. We want to make sure they reconnect afterwards and all that stuff. So this was something that we found that actually saved us a lot of headaches when we did this during migration times. So this is just the base connections, but in this con query filtered, which is connection queries filtered, we kind of modified this a little bit when you look at this query to like get out some stuff. And again, we were looking at that SPID/SPATS log, and I'm going to kind of clean this up a little bit to get some of the names out of here because I thought I had done that. But we excluded out the DBA's names, right? So we had all the DBAs excluded out who we didn't want to see in there. We had certain service accounts, right? And we took out all the SQL Server Management Studio connections, all the ones that were coming from our DBA utilities. And so what happens when we get that connections query filtered, looking at here, is that we just basically have our application servers, right? I got rid of all my ETL servers, all the backend servers that we knew about from SSIS that we weren't worried as DBAs that were doing stuff. So we just put this in here. And I still had in the connections all those ETL servers so I could look at them. But during migration time, I'm going to kind of be able to look at this and use this. And so I'm going to look at it over time. And this also gave me when I had to come up with validation testing, because believe it or not, we would think sometimes we knew all the application owners, and then somebody would get really upset that, you know, we hadn't been contacted about a move. So logging these connections, knowing kind of what application servers were being used was a really good way for us to then go out and have the developers look at these hosts and say, what's running? Who is this? And we would get a good use of people to do our validation testing. So that is what the connections query filtered is for. And so index usage. This was a really interesting one, right? So this again is that detailed index usage stat. So what we have done in this query right here, and let's see if I've got it in here. Unused tables is the DB query is the name of this one right here. I think we're rolling up index usage by DB right here. So in that query, what we are doing is rolling up all the index usage of those databases, right? By databases. And we can do it again right here by the unused tables. But here we're rolling up all the indexes by the database. And so what you get in here is that, and when I log that index usage over time, I can tell you, right, if I just run this straight, I'll only have it since the last reboot of SQL Server. But when I run this and I've been collecting my index usage for, months at a time, I can say, hey, I've got these two databases over here. Maybe they're big, maybe they're not. I think when I looked back over on the other spreadsheet, they were quite large, but I can see that nobody's read from this database. Nobody's written to this database. And when I go look at my connections filtered, I can see nobody's actually ran anything. And I've also got this procedure usage right here where we're tracking the procedure usage in those databases. So we can see that nobody's actually kind of really been doing anything in those databases. So they're kind of sitting there unused. And when we looked at this, what we found, right? Because when you talk about moving databases that have been around for a long time, it turned out application teams had either decommissioned applications or they had done some kind of migration at the application level without including the database team. We found orphan data that they had forgotten to move. We found data that was just sitting there, was duplicated someplace else in the system. So we had a whole lot of that. Like, when I first started working there, I was like, I have like 5 databases of the same name and they're not all being replicated. Why are they all over the place? And it turned out to be, and I had connections going to all of them. But when I started kind of filtering out this, I had some that had no connections. And if you look at this one, I marked all the ones that were in green that were really good. But what about this one right here? What if that was the same name, right, from another server? And I see that only had 212 seeks maybe. There wasn't that much usage in it. What we found out was that there was sometimes old ETL processes or some monitoring process that somebody had forgotten to move that was still pointing to the old machine. So we could clean that up, get that pointed to the right machine. Those processes had been failing and nobody realized it, and then decommission that database. But we didn't really kind of just get rid of the database. What we would do, and we'll talk about them in a minute, we just kind of flagged them for right now to look at that. And so the procedure usage was a good one. And then unused tables was another really good one that we did. So we've got the unused kind of table query in here as well. But what happens is for these, all these green ones are kind of really good. We can see that maybe there's a row count, there's some data in there. We were looking at these and I'm not really that concerned about some of these because I don't know what they are, right? You look at some of these names, you're like, I have no idea what that is. But some of these, when you look at tables, you may have seen this before you guys lock down permissions to a database. There are user tables that people use to temporarily store data in that shouldn't have been there, right? It was just kind of wanting to look at a table as it was. And they didn't save it under their, their database profile. So it's just sitting out there. And so I found these and I kind of put this name in there that nobody's reading from this data, right? It's a copy of other data. I can tell that. And they're pretty large databases, right? I saw some of them out there that were massive, where somebody had been trying to build a report and they never did anything with it. It was just kind of a test. And they were just sitting out there unused and taking up terabytes of space. And so we just marked those as cleanup. Also, another good thing for these can be, a lot of times, if you go back and look at the database, if this is a replicated database, and these are tables that nobody is looking from, right? They're not going to be writing to them that they're replicated tables. But if nobody's reading from them, we were able to use this data to then go back at some point and say, hey, we might want to get rid of that. So that is like some of the first kind of information that we were gathering. We haven't really acted on it yet. The next part I told you about was this kind of checks that we would run. So in here, and I pulled up a couple of them, we had a DDL trigger, right? That can cause some issues during migration. If you might need to turn it off, like while you're doing some of your changes and scripts for the migration, then turn it back on and make sure that it's running on the other server. So we check, is there a DDL? We'll have to account for that in our scripting. Is there any SQL DMO that we are going to have to account for? Those can happen, and we got bit by it. TDE encryption, you don't ever want to miss that, like get migrated and then realize you don't have the TDE key come live. So we would do a search and mark all the databases that had TDE keys. And by the way, because things can change as you're setting them up, we ran these checks over and over again because we had instances where we ran them, we could document and say, hey, there was no TDE encryption. And then maybe a week before the migration, somebody put a TDE key in. That was a change that had went in from the application people. And we had to account for that when we did the migration. Link servers. You should be looking for your link servers. And I have that in the checklist, but are you using them? Do you need to even move them? We would usually move them, but kind of do something to disable them after the migration. But this will go through all your code and find out, are you referencing any of those linked servers in your code? So it's looking for those names in your code. Do you use database mail? What are the dependencies on that? And do you need to account for that? Don't forget about those settings. So we have all these things, right? Even master encrypted databases are in here. Feature dependencies are in here. Checking the affinity mask, right? You want to make sure that it matches. Maybe it's wrong, but you need to at least know what it is and possibly account for it when you're doing those migrations. So that is all going to be in the documentation part. And everything that we do in here, when you run these checks, one person does them, right? Does them, sets up the new server and applies them, somebody else kind of goes back and double checks them. So let's go back to our session where we are going to the screen of the presentation. So here we go. And I think the way it does this lovely little thing that I do like, I think it starts the presentation over every time. So we are going to get this back in. Also, if you do try using this feature on Zoom, be prepared. Make a really good copy of your presentation, because I did not. I just kept it all locally. And the first time I did this, I spent a long evening. It deleted my entire presentation when Zoom crashed. I love Zoom. I'm not sure if it was Zoom or PowerPoint. One of them wasn't happy, and it rolled back my presentation, even though it had been saved and worked on. It corrupted out the original one, so I had to go back. So make sure that if you're playing around with that, you have a copy of what you're working on before you just start sharing it, because that feature is in beta. So we went through, clicking on the wrong screen. So we went through all of these different spreadsheets. Now it is time to build your server, right? So everything that we just gathered in there, we're going to build your server, right? So when I built out my servers, if I had it, let's just say my server, my instance name was database instance 1. When I would set up the new one, we called it database instance 1 _ new. And we kept these names very kind of lined up because we had large groups. We wanted everybody to kind of realize what everything was for. And we were usually migrating multiple servers, right? I called it having a couple in the hopper, because migrating is not just about scheduling my downtime. There were application owner downtimes that had to be accounted for. And something could flux in and out. Maybe they had some kind of issue where they could not, a critical deployment they had to do, and they were going to have to pull that migration out. But we had a really tight timeline, right? I told you how many servers we were migrating. So we had them at least 2, 3 in the hopper, usually at a time, so that if one kind of pulled back a little bit, we could move forward with another one. So we had all these going. You documented your port numbers. So now you got your database names. Make sure that all those settings match, including your port numbers. I put a couple in here that I didn't maybe have as clear on the spreadsheet. It wasn't a Word document, our deployment plan that we had, but make sure those port numbers match your service account. If you can keep the same service account, please do, because it would be great if everything was kind of group-based permission, but when you're dealing with legacy applications, that doesn't always happen. And sometimes people have explicitly given permissions to that particular user at some kind of application level. And so it can be kind of, that can get you if you don't use the same service account. So there's lots of things to make sure you have the same permission set up for the service accounts at the SQL Server layer. But we've had file shares, all different kinds of things that that wasn't quite easy for us to see that would get with you. Apply all those settings that we just talked about, those CLR settings and those mail settings, and make sure they match. And again, have somebody go through the spreadsheet and double check and make sure that they did them. And put the SP configure settings for the view server into that spreadsheet. And I've got the code down here for how you set that. It's pretty easy. SP configure show advanced options with one. So that is setting up your server. That's just the base build before you've ever started doing anything for migrating. And I wanted to kind of throw this in here because we went from these servers that were kind of configured all over the place. And as we migrated, we implemented some new good standards. We made sure we had a common utility database. I didn't talk about this in here, but we had our DBA utility databases. We made sure we kind of updated that and made sure that was deployed in the same way. We were trying to do it legacy-wise, but it's easier when you're doing to a new server. Then we actually made sure we finally, with each migration, right? It wasn't every place all the time, but as we did each migration, we made sure we went to a standard drive layout. And this I've used at probably 4 different companies. It seems to work really well. We had our C drive, we didn't mess with that. We had our E drive, that was where all of our software was installed, right? And our system databases might be over there. But what was the good thing for us was going to mount points. And this works for you're going to do on-premise cloud, any kind of automation. Having this like X, it's a hanger, we called it a hanger. It might be a meg file. It wasn't big, right? So it was a little bitty drive. It's just a regular drive that you, this one you're presenting as a drive letter. But off of that, you're going to take all your other mount points and put them under that hanger. And what that is really useful for is that when you go to look for all of your drives that you need to find for your server and you want to apply certain things to SQL Server, everything for SQL Server is under, besides your software, is under that X drive. So now in future migrations, future things you're going to do, you can take everything under that X and apply certain rules and move it. And then the drives that we came out with, right? Because now we're going with named drives rather than drive letters. It was data 01, data 02. So technically it would look like X data 01, X data 02. And this is what we started off with, X log 01 and log 02. And then we actually had an X backup 01 and backup 02, and then tip 01 and tip 02. This was our small configuration. So we had 2 of every drive. I think many years ago, I started off with 1 of every drive, but now it's really easy as I have to add another data and log drive or backup drive or temp drive. I never have to figure out what is the next name because they're just going to go in sequence. When I need to add another data drive, automatically it's data 03. And we did some really neat things with automating things for drive space and log space and alerts so that those could all be automated. We didn't have to go in and manually do them. And it was easy because we had this great common drive layout. If you're trying to figure out, should it be G or F or what should it be, it's kind of hard to automate those drives. So think about this when you're setting up your new server. The other thing is you never should, when you go to mount points, if you haven't used them, never put your data directly on the mount point. There's some things with permissions that can be a little wonky. You should always put your data in a folder under that mount point, because sometimes it can take the folders and mark them as read-only. Data under them is completely fine. And what we did was that we had a script that created our folders. And whether it was a data drive or a log drive or a backup drive, we always had backup data and log. And why do we do that? Because people, right? You have these drives where things should go, but sometimes people are out of space. And rather than waiting, or because they can't wait for the appropriate drive to be put in place in an emergency, they might have to put a backup folder somewhere, backup somewhere on your data drive or on your log drive. Or maybe they're running out of space on the log drive and they're going to go to the backup folder and put that log drive over there. Well, you have certain things that you don't want to do to your log folders, right? And you want to make sure that you're backing up certain things. So if you put those folders under every single drive, when people do what they're going to do, you now know where to look, and it's going to be in an automated fashion. So you don't have to ever worry about, well, somebody didn't follow the process because you thought about this, and now you have a process for this. So that's my little a little bit more on my little tangent about drive layouts. I call them my mom rules, but I think everybody should be kind of really organized. It makes things easier for you. And the backup drive, I think, is one of the most underused functions. And we started doing this to use it for other things. All right, as we were rolling out Always On, there's lots of things that you have to keep track of. So for one, we kept all of our Always On scripts in a folder called Always On for backup. right? We then had under our backup drives, you can see we had all the different databases under the backup drive, which typically use for, right? But what if you have CDC, right? Or encryption, right? You need to keep the notes for how to do the encryption, or maybe the encryption key. We actually kept our encryption keys in a repository, but we might have some documentation about how to do the encryption processes. Or what if we were adding indexes or removing indexes? So we put all that stuff in this jobs folder. We even had, if you look under here, we have replication, and you can see we have post-replication code and pre-replication code, right? As you do always on failovers, you have to account for like sometimes doing this stuff on the new server. If you have it on your backup folder and you're replicating that backup folder over to the new server, you now know where all that's going to go. In a DR situation, now all the documentation is in one place. One time we decided it would be great to put it all in SharePoint or some other place in the cloud. No internet access, SharePoint was down. Both of those have hit us. So keeping it on the drive, knowing that we should always restore the backup drive first for every server. And that was where all of our documentation was. That was the go-to. We might have a list of like which servers were critical first, that we were all had hard copies somewhere. That's where all of our documentation was kept. So just keep that in mind. It's very useful. And we're going to kind of use this folder in a little bit for some of our cleanup that we're going to do on our servers. So now before you even start setting up to migrate, right? You've got your old server, you've done the documentation, and you've set up your new server. Well, before you start setting up what you're going to move, maybe you want to think about what you don't want to move and what's going to make it easier when you move. So here are some of the things that we did, right? We talked about this, that we logged index usage stats for about at least 6 months before we started doing some of this stuff. And we logged user connections, right? Ran a little SP who, logged who's connecting to the server. And that's great for getting these intermittent connections that might only pop up quarterly, right? What if you got a little SOA architecture and it only comes in for quarterly end of year reporting? It's going to catch these kind of things. And we saw how we were aggregating our indexes to find those orphan databases. Don't know if I touched on this earlier, but our first go around with just a couple servers, we removed 20 terabytes of orphaned data. We got business sign off for all of this, but we found a whole lot of orphaned and duplicate data in our system. And when I finally started doing this, I thought about all the other places I had worked and thought, I wonder how much data was out there that people weren't using because we hadn't really looked at it that way before. The other thing is that we never did just, we never just kind of got rid of anything for the most part. We always like either offlined an instance or a database for a really long time in case there was an error that we had somehow missed. I think we only really had it happen once in the SPID stats log or in the user connections where we had one that was just kind of going away really quickly that we didn't catch. And that way we can offline it. And if something comes up, we can really online it before that happens. So just offline it first before you kind of remove a database, but we'll talk about that. So we're getting ready to migrate. And we're going to do some automation about our users, right? We're going to enable and move users and do all that stuff. So think about all those users that shouldn't be there, right? Those disabled users, those users who no longer have permissions in your system. There's a script in the repository, go out and find it. And all you have to do is drop and create those users, right? That's how you do it. You can drop and recreate and save the code so you can get them back if you need to. And those users you save in your dropped users. And I don't have it in this screenshot, but we always have also a current users folder that every day we clean out what's in there and we put in our current list of users. We archive actually under the current, there's an archive folder, and we take that current user and archive it off, right? So that we had what was there before. And then when we ever have to do any kind of failover, right, in between data centers, now we have our script to recreate our users. But then the dropped users are no longer kind of mucking up and something we don't have to maintain. And this will make it easier when you see some of what we're going to do with some of the stuff for the migrations and jobs, right? So it's the same thing. We're going to be moving and disabling jobs. So there's a whole lot of jobs that aren't actually running. You don't have to maintain them. If you've ever had to search through 1,000 different jobs to find the one job you needed because they're not documented well and you don't know what they are, this is one of the things that you can do to get this kind of under control. And we've got a script like everything else, right? Look at this. There's a whole bunch of like unscheduled, constantly failing jobs or jobs with disabled schedules that haven't ran in forever, right? So when you have this, we've got this job that will, the script that will find out disabled jobs, scheduled disabled jobs, and unscheduled jobs. So when you run that, you can find all the jobs, and then all you have to do is go and right click on those jobs, script, drop and recreate, and save it to your dropped user folder. And then you can get rid of that job, but you can always get it back, right? Developers always want to save their jobs. Well, it's there if they ever want to go back and look at it. And then you can only see the failing jobs. This also makes it a whole lot easier for you to monitor your jobs in the future. The other thing, and I don't think I talked about it in here, and this thing I talk about in some of my other talks, we even like proactively, right? I don't know why people named things what they do without changing like or getting rid of what they named the job. We prefixed all the jobs with the database name that they were running. When we were going through and looking at these jobs, we prefix them with the database. So now in the future, it was a lot easier if we had to do database maintenance to run a query and figure out, oh, these are all the jobs that touch this database. Sometimes there might be a couple databases names in there, but we could, as it was prefixed at the beginning of the job, find them really quickly. And if we had an application that maybe touched 5 different databases or something like that, we would still have the database names in there, but if we knew what the application was, that would actually go very first. And so that might make it a little bit easier when you're trying to do those jobs, but make them a little bit more meaningful. And then the unused databases, right? So we talked about nobody's reading and writing from this data, right? And then this one, over 6 months, we had 212 user seeks. I think if I touched on this, what this was it was an alert that was supposed to go monitor and make sure nothing was in a failed state in this database that had been decommissioned for a long time. So because that was so little, that was something that was worth my time to figure out why do I have a massive database sitting out there with only 212 seeks over 6 months or so, right? And it was a check that wasn't running all the time. And so it actually was pointing to the wrong server. So we were able to go back through our spit stats log, figure out what it was that was really randomly, intermittently connecting to this database, go talk to them, figure out what it did and be like, shouldn't it be pointed over here? Yes, and it actually fixed a whole lot of problems when we got it repointed to the right place. But again, developers had moved a database, didn't tell anybody, just said, I need a database with the same name over here. We're spinning up a new application. Didn't tell the DBAs they were getting rid of the old application, but forgot to move some of their code. So that can be really good for getting rid of the unused databases. Now, log shipping. I think this is the best method for moving databases. I've done backups and restores, and I've done backups with differentials. And those all work, right? The backups with differentials, they're easy. But if you've got a lot of data to move or you got a small downtime, log shipping is going to be the quickest way to move your data. Again, we were able to move massive amounts of data with like a 2-minute downtime once we got this whole methodology done. Setup takes a whole lot, but the outage really, really small. And I think that's usually what's important. And there is a wizard. You can right click on your kind of tasks for your database and go to ship transaction logs. And it's going to come in here, and you do have to create a share, right? Because it has to have something that the other server can access. So you got to give it the drive path and the share. And then everything else is kind of just the default. I do check to compress the backup because it's going to be moving it between 2 different servers. So I like doing that. And then I do tell it to like, go ahead and kick off a full backup, right? So you do want that to happen. And then here is where it's going to be copying it to your target server. So you had to click connect, right? I was on SQL 00 before, and now I'm moving to SQL 01 to set up my database that is going to be the target for that log shipping. And then once I do that, I'm going to give the copy, the drive where I want it to copy those databases to, and it's going to clean those up. And I want that database left in no recovery mode. I don't want it up and people being able to look at that data. I want it just kind of sitting there while that's going on. And then it just kicks off the wizard. And that's one way of setting up log shipping. There are many ways to do log shipping. DBA Tools, Gary Bardsley did a good blog on this. And I've got two parts of his blog right in here where he just kind of used the DBA Tools and they can set up the log shipping. You can write a wrapper that goes around this that will set up, and that's what we had some code that we put a wrapper around that would just go through and find all the database names and set up the log shipping, but it kind of would like wait a little bit because you don't want to kick it all off at once, right? So we would do them in groups. Don't set up 100 databases to log ship all at once with backups going across the network. Somebody's going to hate you, but do a little bit at a time. And then this is another method of doing this with a script. Again, it's a script. It's really easy if you got a batch of like a little group that you want to do. And Brian Davey did this and it's on SQL Server Central. If I recreate the wheel for you guys, somebody else has already done it. But this will go out here and set up log shipping with a script, kind of the same thing that the PowerShell was doing, which is the more modern way. But this was a little bit more similar to how we used to do it back in the day, getting our group of servers. So all of these will get you log shipping, right? And so that's just once the initial backup, the larger portion of that is ran, we would set up usually our smaller ones first, or maybe the really big one first, and then do some of the smaller ones in batches. But we would do the larger databases by themselves to get the initial large backup done and over. So that might take a week or two to get all of those kind of up and going. Then you just have them sitting there, waiting. Sometimes they would wait for 2 or 3 months till we could get the appropriate outage window to get them moved. But then that's just going to sit there. Now, you need to constantly monitor the log shipping, and I would have people go in and manually check it as well. And we had scripts that was part of the job that the DBAs would run, and then we automated those scripts, but manually check the log shipping. And I've got a script in the repository that will show you like the last restore date. So we had an alert that anything was being log shipped. And we found that was the best way because some of the log shipping monitors didn't always work. So we would throw an alert if anything had a restore date older than X, right? If it was older than 3 hours, that would alert. But then the week of the migration, I manually had my team go check it because I don't know. We had a really large group. Somebody disabled one of the monitors one time and it like really kind of was not good the day we went to go to do the migration. So do check that manually. Also have, again, because you could have had change control tickets go in where some of those database settings that you have set earlier have now changed. So rerun all those checks that you did in that first phase to make sure that A and B match. And if you do like have a difference, you need to put a note on it and document it that that was a known exception so that if anything goes wrong during the migration, you're good. Usually when you do this due diligence, right, and you have different people doing it, and it's really key that different people do it. So if you have the same guy, he's gonna be like, yeah, I know I did that. And it just kind of gets out of habit. Somebody's gonna miss it. And then particularly if you're new at this, you need to do dry runs, right? So do dev tests first, right? Do those dry runs, but at least have different people walk through and you're going to see what the scripts are that we're going to run during the migration because it's not just you guys, right? You're going to have your Windows team and your networking team making some changes. And you're going to have people testing. So I do like to have, and I know this is terrible because we're all working from home now, and this may be a much, but we did have to have finally that you were required to be on site for a migration. And reasons why we required people to be on site for a migration was we were in the middle of a large migration and one of the people working on the migration had a network outage, right, where they could not connect and we did not quite know where they were in the process. Also, if something goes wrong, trying to communicate over the laptop while you're troubleshooting and somebody can't look over your shoulder is kind of hard. And lastly, I actually had a tester who we could not move forward with until testing was complete. Otherwise, we were going to have to roll back. So we completely did a huge, huge migration of a very critical system. And by the time it came around for the tester, right, these are late night changes, there was snoring on the line and we could not wake him up and we had to roll back because nobody could get the testing done. So, it happens late at night. So that's why we had people on site so that, we can go tap you on the head. You go sleep in the corner, do whatever you needed to do. But when it came time to testing, we knew where you were and we could go grab you because it wasn't just once. It happened a couple of times. Like people would just like get tired of waiting around and like leave. So we're like, no. So day of migration, what are you going to do? Well, one, you want to make sure a change freeze is in effect because you're now going to script some stuff that you can't account for if it changes later. It's going to mess you up. So no changes can go out without going through the migration team so you could go correct your scripts, right? It has to be an emergency. Maybe you don't want to migrate if that emergency just happened on the day of the migration, right? Some emergency code push had to be pushed. You might want to think about that there's some stuff going on with that application server that maybe today is not the day for you. Go move another server. Wait. But change freeze, right? So the first thing you're going to do, right? Most of our scripts that we have that I'm going to show you in a minute were dynamic. So we created them. They worked all the time. They automatically generated their own code, but there was a couple things that didn't. So one of them is the rev logins. You're going to script that out. Do not add the logins to the server. Your databases are being log shipped. So what happens is there's several things that we tried, like adding the users and having them disabled. They don't add quite cleanly for the Logship databases. So if somewhere in them they have the default database set as one of the Logship databases, that is not going to get properly set. A couple other things, so that even if you run the rev login, it's not going to work. So just script out what your current logins, right? And you clean them up. So you should only have active logins and save that to the script. Now I have my server saved in all of these like names, but what we did to make sure that the server was actually changed, somebody had worked on this, we could one, see the date, two, we had them so that nobody confused these, that my server was actually put in there with the legitimate server name. So we knew that was the logins for like my DB2, right? Or my DB1, one of those. So script out your logins and save them there. You also are going to script out if you have any transactional replication. Now is the time that you need to prep because we're going to move transactional replication. We changed a couple things with our replication, and we won't get into the complications. We would change sometimes distributors, right? You can change that in there. But the basics, if you're keeping the same distributor, what you can do is script out your replication, but all of your subscribers, you need to change the sync type in here, and let me get out of your way, to sync type equals replication support option, right? Because what is going to happen is you're basically telling it that the replication is already in sync and that you don't need it to be initialized. So it's not going to take a snapshot, because what we're going to do during this migration for this short period, we're going to make sure replication's finished sending all of its commands. And then we're going to lock the users out of the database so that the database is going to be in sync, right? The source and the target are going to be in sync. Nobody's going to be allowed in until we put replication back first. So you won't have to reseed replication, which can be very, very painful. So this is how we found a way to get around it when we tested, and this worked like a champ. We never had an issue with this. Once we do these steps in place, we had an issue one time because somebody thought they could like ninja something in and nobody would notice. So you're going to right click on those, right? The next thing you have to do once you got your users, right? And you've scripted out your replication and put that sync type in there. Again, have somebody double check it. You're doing this the morning, like at 8 a.m. If you got a midnight migration, this is the morning team's job. The other thing they're going to do, and if you go and look at your jobs and right click on them and bring up the object, what is it? Explore details that you can see up here. This will let you select multiple jobs and right click on them and click script job as create to file. And then you can save it as, the file name as your 12_my server jobs. And you're like, why are these numbers in there? This is the order they're going to be executed in so that there's no confusion, like nobody goes out of order. So Again, save it with the server name in there as well, but script those jobs out. Don't do the log shipping jobs. I have them highlighted in here. They all have LS in them. Just skip those, do everything else but those log shipping jobs, because you do want those to you don't want to recreate those, because that'll be a mess. But anyway, so that is all the prep that you have to do that day before the migration. Now, 2 hours before the migration, there's a couple of other things you're going to do. One, now that you have scripted out and your jobs and you know what they are, right? And you're going to be able to recreate them. What you want to do, because you don't want to have reindexing going on, you don't want to be thinking like some big long backup process kicking off that you got to wait for it to run. If you had a full backup, you can go ahead and kill that early on in the morning, go ahead and disable that. But what you want to do is disable all of your jobs. Don't worry, you got log shipping going on, so your database is still being backed up. You're good there. But if you can, about 2 hours before the migration, when we do this, sometimes an hour, but we would run this little script right here. And again, this is in the steps. You'll see this. You're going to run this script to disable all of your jobs, right? Except for log shipping. Now, we also would disable database and Windows monitoring, right? It took them a little bit to get this done. When we would forget, it would just set off all kinds of alarms during the migration time. So we just made sure that we notated that we were going to do that, or put them in maintenance mode so they knew that it was okay, but they weren't going to fire alarms. The other thing that's going to be really important to do, your server name, your cluster name, the AG name, any GTM names that you have, you need to have the Windows team. They need to know this is coming. This is why you have to coordinate with them. They should have a ticket scheduled that 2 hours before the migration, they set the TTL, which is the time to live, to 0, because it defaults to about 60 minutes. And what can happen if they don't do that? When you go to do some of these things with the servers and move them and try to rebuild replication, and if you have a global company, it could take an hour or more for all that stuff to replicate. The default TTL is 60 minutes, right? That's just for the base server, and then it's got to replicate out everywhere. So you could have an application server holding on to that connection string, and your migration time will take longer, and they're going to have to restart apps if you don't set that TTL to 0. So hopefully now you've checked hopefully your TTL beforehand, found out that it's usually set to 60. Double check that before you get to this point, right? Early on in your process, what is your current TTL? But set it to 0 if you're at the default. So, so that it's going to time out. That means every time they're going to check to see what is the IP address, so that when you go to do your migration, things actually work. So this is your prep work, 2 hours before the migration. Oh, and I had one other thing in here. And here it is. C, grab active user connections. This is going to be really important. So this is that same query that was in our spreadsheet earlier, the filtered. So the filtered is getting rid of SQL Server Management Studio queries. We got rid of our DBA servers. What we're really trying to get at in here is application servers. So I don't care if my DBAs were querying. I don't care about anything from SQL Server Management Studio. I don't care about SSIS. What I want to know is what are my application servers are right before the migration. Because after the migration, I want to make sure they're reconnecting. Hopefully most applications are smart enough to restart. We found this really easy. We used to have the application team stop their applications, but after multiple companies and multiple times of them saying we stopped all the applications and us watching them still connect to the database and us having to do what I'm about to show you in a minute, we just said, screw it. We're handling it because I just watched you battle for an hour and you couldn't figure it out. So maybe you don't have that problem, but that was what we faced multiple places. So I was like, I'm not dealing with you guys. I'm going to handle it myself. We're just disabling it. And we're going to tell you guys what didn't reconnect. And if you have to go restart a service, they would check their services, but they would sometimes say they were fine, but that connection query would be like, what about this one? And they'd be like, they go check it. They're like, oh yeah, that service is down. So that can be helpful. So they would know it would help them narrow their focus a little bit instead of the broad check. So this is what you're doing, the A, B, C, D, and E, and then the Windows team is doing A right before the migration, right? So now your change freeze is still in effect and it's time for the migration. The migration party is getting ready to start. So all these scripts that we talked about, right? You used to save some of these with the little my server name in there. Where is it? 10, I think. That's the replication one. And then the jobs was 12. And then we've got another one in there. So this is all of the scripts that we have. And you guys will have access to this. So with each of these steps, they are separated out because you got to go check something to make sure it's actually done before you proceed. It's really quick. We would actually bring them up sometimes, and sometimes we'd have groups of DBAs doing them. Sometimes we'd have one DBA. We had them all opened up in sequential order and would just keep running each one until that portion finished. So again, when we got good at it, 2 minutes. Don't try to do it in 2 minutes your first time. Take your time, walk yourself through them. First thing you're going to do is disable all the logins. That's why you got to clean up your logins. So this script will figure out who all your logins are and disable them all. This locks all the users out of the database. And so what you're going to do once you disable those logins, just because you disable them doesn't mean they have disconnected, right? The downtime outage window has started. So now what you have to do is kill all the user connections and make sure they don't reconnect, right? That they're not back in there. Every once in a while, and I think we've accounted for it in the script, we would have somebody that had super user access or something weird where our kill wasn't working. So yeah, but I think I figured out how to do that one differently. And I've got a list of names. And so if you didn't have the right list of names in your exclusion, because you do have to put those names of those ones you don't want killed, like your service account, right? You don't want that killed for your SQL server because you need that up to do stuff. So do this. So kill your user connections and monitor it. It's all in one script. So kill and then run the monitor. So you just run the whole script. Once you've killed everything, did anything else pop back up? Because you should have excluded yourself. You should have excluded your service account, so nothing else should be popping in there. Takes about a minute, right? Now that you have killed your user connections, what you want to do on your distribution server, if you were doing replication, is run this distribution for script and for a script. This will, 4 kicks off the distribution jobs to make sure that they're going again. And for the A script will let you know if there are any undistributed commands. You do not want to start or finish up your log shipping going to the new server with undistributed commands sitting in your distribution database. If distribution is behind and you start on the next step, you're going to have to reseed all your replication and it's not going to be fun. So again, this usually the most I've ever seen this really take is a minute because we monitor replication, but just wait a second till it's done. So I think maybe one time we had to wait 5, but yeah, time varies. So just run that, make sure everything's out of there, and then you're good to go. Now that everything has done, you're ready to kind of wrap up your log shipping. So on your source server, what you're going to do is start the log shipping jobs and disable them. So you're going to kick them off one more time. They're basically going to take another transaction log back of everything, and then you are disabling the rest of those jobs. So as soon as they're finished running, it's time for you to go to the next phase. And I highlighted in here, as you can see up there, which server you're on, because right now is when you start. Before you were always on your source server. Now you're going you went from the distribution server now back to your source server. Now the other teams are going to do something. And the reason why we have this in here is because there had been errors a couple of times that would cause us to roll back. Something happened with DNS. So this is where we have the networking team do their GTMs and the Windows team does the rename. If they can't do that portion, we're rolling back right now. So before you've done anything else, that is going to make it really hard, because the only thing you have to do is run your enable login script and enable your jobs, and you're done and you're rolled back, right? So you're pretty easy. So this is the steps that they have to take that we found was kind of the thing for C names and for changing names. Now I had in here that, so for us, we were taking, because we were moving to from a failover cluster to AGs. is that we took that old failover cluster name and we made it into a CNAME. But if you're just moving like servers, you can just do the rename instead. But what we also did to make sure that DNS properly worked once they said they were done, because sometimes they said they were done and things didn't work, we went to not the host machine that we were migrating from, but one of us went to our laptop or to the jump box if we didn't have laptops. And we went to SQL Server Management Studio and tried to connect to the new server once they had done the rename to make sure we were right where we were supposed to be. If I saw a bunch of disabled logins and like stuff like that looked like the old server, I was like, oh, nope, we're still pointing to the old place, right? So that is the DBAs need to verify. And once you do that, you're good to go. It should be really quick to wrap up. So what you're going to do now is start the log shipping copies, right? It's going to go grab those database backups and copy them over. Once that's done, right? You don't want to start the other process. Then you can start the restore. But you don't want to start this process before the copy is done, because otherwise you're going to miss something. And again, you'll have lost some data. So now start the restore on the new server and disable the jobs. Again, you just run this script, it's in the folder, and it creates this code down here that you then go paste into another browser and run, and that generates your code. It's the same every time, it always generates the code. So once that's done, now it's time to bring the restoring databases online and remove the log shipping. So should take just a second. It's pretty quick to do this. And again, this code, step 8 in the code project, will do all that for you really quickly. You can run it if you got 500 databases, it'll right through them. Now, once you are at this point, right, your users are still locked out, so no transactions are going back and forth. This is when you run that replication script that you created. This is going to put the replication back in. There's no transactions set there, right? You made sure the distributor was clear, and you told it you don't need to reinitialize everything. So it's just kind of came back up and both the data is in sync. So wait for this to finish. This is going to be probably the longest script you can run. Sometimes it took a minute. Sometimes it took like 5, depending on how complicated the replication was. But you shouldn't have a whole lot of activity. It just takes sometimes a little bit for it to build all the replication scripts. So easy enough. Now that you have done this, right, and replication's in sync, now this is where you enable your users. So you run the login script, right? Because now all your databases are out of the restoring state. Users should automatically start reconnecting if your applications are built that way. So now you can start monitoring for failed logins, right? You did that earlier. You had that script looking for failed logins because some logins fail all the time. So that's why you want to know if you had failed logins before. So are they the same failed logins, or is this a new thing? Maybe they need to restart something. And then while they're looking at their applications and doing that validation, it's a good idea for you guys to go ahead and do that check and make sure that those connections are reconnecting with that connections filtered script. And you might be able to quickly target where they need to go reboot something. It's amazing how when we start looking at it from that perspective, we can usually target it much quicker than the application teams often can. They may have thousands of services they have to restart, and they would go blindly do them, but you can maybe narrow it down to 1 or 2 that they need to restart. And that is it. Once you do that, it's pretty easy. Now, there's a couple things that you have to do, but the database is open and ready for transactions, like business is going. But do monitor it for 24 hours, right? You just need to, because some weird stuff happens, right? I don't know. We had a connection string one time. It turned out somebody had put an IP address and an encrypted DDL that intermittently connected, so we had to go fix it. Or something just kind of got hosed up and we had to reset a connection because somehow, even though it shouldn't have, it was caching the IP address and it wasn't going off the TTL record. But once that's done, then you can run your job script, right? You're going to re-enable all your jobs. That should you have your backups in there. Part of what you want to do with your backup validation is, now that you move to a new server, kick off some full backups, get them running, right? Make sure that you're good to go on the server. And then you want to run some backup validation scripts to make sure that's going on. You want to keep monitoring for failed logins to make sure everything's good. We chose not to, even if we were migrating between server versions, right? We usually were. This is not the time. A server to server move is a lot. You just had to do a whole lot to get into a new IP, usually space, something else. This is not when we flip the database compatibility mode. we separated out failure domains. This was phase one. We wrote, still ran, don't run your normal index usage process. We ran this SPMS for each DB, update stats all anyway after the migration, even though we didn't flip mode. I just think it's a good practice to do. About 2 weeks later, we would put a ticket in to flip mode. And of course, when you flip mode, absolutely run this SPMS for each DB. I've seen people run some like kind of targeted index update processes. Those don't work. If you switch compatibility modes, your stats are all going to be jacked up. You do need to run this SP update stats, but I do recommend separating those out so that you, right, have an issue. If it's just that compatibility mode is causing you an issue, it's really easy to flip it back. But if you do it with the migration move, they may make you roll back to the other server because they can't differentiate what the issue is. So this is just a little bit safer to do. And you are done. You have migrated your server in just a few minutes, right? I know that was a lot of prep work. It sometimes takes like maybe a month, a couple weeks to get all this set up, but you have just done it in a few minutes of time. And it is really kind of tried and true. It works a lot. And so I thank everybody, you know, and Microsoft for supporting the Data Platform Geeks. I'm actually really excited to kind of do this talk. And keep in mind that, you know, take your hashtag selfie, right, with the hashtag DPS 2020. And I look forward to hearing all of your questions that you have about this. I like talking about migrations, even though I'm glad I don't have to do them anymore. Actually say I came to Pure because I never wanted another database migration again. But hopefully that will be very helpful to you. And I look forward to talking to you guys. All right. Have a good day. Thank you.